Alright, today what we're going to do is go through your Unit 14 gallery walk on life after the Civil War. Please be sure you are using your sheet with this, and we're going to go ahead and delve into this. Your sheet that goes with this, you do not have to turn in for points, but please be sure you're keeping track of a lot of these things because these will be things that you will be tested on with this unit on Reconstruction. Gallery walk, life after the Civil War. An end to slavery. One of the biggest things that comes after, the Civil War is just this freeing of slaves. When you think about it in the perspective of American history, slavery existed in the United States for over 250 years. Basically, from the time that white people took over this country, there were African American slaves living here. And so when slavery ends after the Civil War, this isn't something that happened for a short period of time. This is something that is generational and that had been happening a long time. So it was a big change that people had to adjust to. After the Civil War, 4 million African American slaves were freed. So now you have 4 million people who have never known what it's like to have freedom, who never had jobs where they're actually paid before, and you're basically just setting them free. Is freedom going to be a tremendous thing for slaves such as this woman? Absolutely, but there are also going to be some hardships as well. Vocabulary word, I want to be sure that you're writing down, and maybe just in the margin of your paper. These new freed men now had to find a place to work, and this term freedmen just means slaves that were freed. But now they had to find a place to work. They had to find a place to live. Many of whom had very little, if any, education. Again, these are people who were not allowed to learn to read and write. They were kept illiterate. They were kept uneducated because the slave owners didn't want them to understand things. They didn't want them to, be able to navigate through the world. And so, just as, even though they're not slaves anymore, it was still a very difficult life. Freedmen's Bureau. Definitely something you need to know about. This was created by Congress on March 3rd, 1865. It was an agency, and their job was basically to oversee the South from slavery to freedom. This existed in 15 southern states, all 11 former Confederate states, plus others that had slavery. So basically, all 15 states in the United States that had slavery, prior to the Civil War, this Freedmen's Bureau, this agency that was to come help these slaves, it existed in all of those states. It is employed mostly by Army personnel. Obviously, this would be Union Army. Many were disabled veterans or disabled active Army personnel. So these are soldiers that basically went down and they were charged, or their job anyway, was to, as best they could, oversee and make sure that these slaves were being treated with fairness. It was employed, as I talked, mostly by them, dealt with issues such as labor, justice, relief, marriage. There were no legal marriages in slavery. And so when slavery was done, if you had two parents, a father and a mother, there weren't any, there were no rules as far as marriage went, so they had to get married because there wasn't any legal paperwork. Friend of the court as well, like if they had kids and a mother and a father didn't want to get married, then they would have to decide, okay, who's going to get custody of, these former slave children. And also education. Freedmen's Bureau wanted to educate these 4 million freed African Americans because without education, and you guys will hear me say this in class, what are you going to do without your education? It's a lot more difficult to get a job if you don't have a good education. Depended on relief efforts monetarily. They were given control of abandoned lands. So the Freedmen's Bureau really depended on monetary donations from different people. The goal of this Freedmen's Bureau, yes, it's to help African Americans, but it was basically to help these newly freed men become self-sufficient. In other words, be able to exist on their own, not need the government for help. But in the meantime, when you're just a newly freed slave and you have no opportunity, it was for Freedmen's Bureau to help them get there. This was not just to allow them to live off from the government. Freedmen's Bureau wasn't a welfare system. Freedmen's Bureau instead was a system that tried to get these African Americans to be able to function on their own. And think about it. If you had spent generations of your life as a slave, you wouldn't know any different. You wouldn't have an education. You wouldn't have opportunities. This was virtually an impossible task, what Freedmen's Bureau was being asked to do. There was much opposition to Freedmen's Bureau. Johnson actually President Andrew Johnson vetoes each Freedmen's Bureau bill, so he was not really behind it. Those in opposition felt that it allowed the freedmen to be lazy, so some people said, well, this is basically a welfare system, and we're just letting these slaves get away with anything. But other people argued, no, these newly freed African Americans do need help. And I'm not going to tell you how to think on that issue, but a lot of people said, look, they need help. Other people said, no, we're being, too nice. This is too much like a welfare system where we're going to let them get away with things. But, the people of Freedmen's Bureau, again, the intent was to help these African Americans become self-sufficient and exist on their own. The Bureau would also help former slaves find their children who had been separated because of slavery. The idea was, let's try to help these slaves. Let's try to help them, find their sons and daughters, because it was all too often that they would be sold away in slavery. And my question for you guys, just to think about, Freedmen's Bureau, obviously it was made to help these former slaves. There's no question about that, but is this enough? Is everything that they were doing here, is this enough to former slaves to give them a fair opportunity? And, I guess I'm just asking for some thought on that issue. Of course, after slavery ends, it's not by any means an end to racism. As you see here with the picture of the Ku Klux Klan, we've talked about this a little earlier in the unit already. Some white Southerners still wanted to exert power over African Americans, and they even formed groups such as the Ku Klux Klan, who you see pictured here. They dress in all white robes. They dress in hoods to disguise their identities. They actually use crosses. They use Confederate flags. They use American flags sometimes. And so, this is just one of the ways that racism was still, I guess that you can see that racism was still a major factor in the United States even after the Civil War. And what's crazy is, and some of you probably know this, the KKK, they still exist today. And they still have rallies all over the country. I remember being at Michigan State as a student, and the KKK wanting to have a rally at the state capitol building, which was just a few miles away from campus. And I remember our school paper had a big deal about that. Should the KKK be allowed to rally and to hold a demonstration? And for those of you curious, they were. These guys were allowed to hold their own meeting out in the public. And for those of you wondering why, think back to your First Amendment, free speech. Even though I would say most of society probably disagrees with the feelings of the KKK, and again, their core belief as Klansmen is just that white is the superior race. It's not that these guys just hate blacks, they hate anyone who's not white. And so, although, most of society would disagree with them, under the First Amendment, they do have a right to assemble, and they do have a right to say what they think. This picture here, I hope that this picture rattles you, because this is just a picture. Whenever I show this to students, it definitely makes an impact. I actually had the first time I ever saw this photo, I had a student walk right out of the room, and the reason for that is the student was just so upset at what they were seeing, and obviously so with what you see here. But the reason I show this photo is not to upset you. It's rather to show you what life was really like in the South. And as horrible and gruesome as this photo is, this was the truth. This is what some of the things that was happening with the Klan. Klan members would basically use intimidation to, obviously here exert power over African Americans, including burning crosses, making threats. And as you can see here, sometimes they would also follow through on these threats. Sometimes the KKK would follow through and they would kill these African Americans. Sometimes they would even kill the white people trying to help the blacks. And so you just had this, not only this intimidation, but sometimes they would act on it. And kids often ask me, well, you can't just do this. You can't just murder people. But what I want you to think about is, do you think former Confederates, these police officers down south, take a look at this crowd. Obviously, this was allowed to happen. The police didn't have a major issue with it. Judges were probably not going to go look to prosecute the men who committed these murders. And so, unfortunately, these types of things were allowed to happen. And it's scary and it's incredible to think about, but this did happen in the South in post-Civil War. Oftentimes, lynchings would occur in southern states. Lynchings were when African Americans would basically be hung, which is the picture you see here of 2 African Americans being lynched. I always ask students, and I'll ask you guys as well, to take a look at the photo and find out, in your opinion, what the most disturbing part of the photo is. And a lot of times kids say, well, this guy right here, he's posing with the picture. He's pointing at it. It's almost like he's on vacation with his family and he's pointing at something, like I might do it with my wife, like, hey, look what I'm in front of. And this guy's clearly posing for this picture, and it's a scary thought. Take a look at this. This to me is the most disturbing part of this entire picture. Maybe even more disturbing than the 2 deaths, because it just shows you that although these deaths occurred, this is how people felt about it in the South. Look at these 2 young people right here. To me, it looks like they're on a date. It looks like they're flirting. It looks like they're having a good time. And I would hope that any of you, if someone asks you to go on a date and you're, looking at 2 murdered bodies, I would hope that you would never go on a date with that person again. But again, these people looking like they're having fun, and I think that's just very disturbing, but it really shows what life was like in the South after Reconstruction and, after the Civil War. Sharecroppers is a term you need to know. Many new freedmen, again, these newly freed African American slaves, they gained work sharecropping. Sharecroppers would rent land and supplies from plantation owners, and then they'd have to repay back the money. What would happen often is that these sharecroppers couldn't make enough money. And so if they couldn't, they had to keep borrowing again from the plantation owners. So oftentimes these sharecroppers couldn't pay the money back, and they'd go into debt. And if you go into debt and you just keep racking up more and more money that you owe that you can't pay, now these sharecroppers, they make very little money, or sometimes they didn't make any money at all. So they're basically just continuously working, but they have to borrow equipment, they have to borrow seed, they have to borrow all the tools in order to be a farmer, and they'd go into debt, and there was no way out of it. And it made it very difficult for many African Americans to get out of poverty. I mean, how are you expected to get out of poverty when you just keep losing money every single year? And so this sharecropping, I often refer to it as sharecrapping, because what these people are getting is crap. They're being treated very unfairly. They're being given a situation where they can't be successful. And so was this sharecropping, was it intended to be a racist thing? Not necessarily, but that's basically the way that it ended up. Voting restrictions. Many southern states passed laws making it very difficult for African Americans to vote. Now, they didn't necessarily have laws saying blacks can't vote, but they would find ways around it. Some places would require what's called a poll tax, which required people, if they wanted to vote, to pay a fee. Now, if you're a rich person, you're going to be able to pay the fee to vote. What if you're a poor person? What if you're a poor African American? You're not going to be able to pay in order to do this. And so this really restricted the black vote. Same thing here. Literacy tests were also sometimes given, where you were basically tested to see if you could read or write. And if you couldn't read or write, then you weren't allowed to vote. Now, most every white person could pass their literacy test. But if you were a newly freedman, if you were a newly freed African American, there's no guarantee you're going to be able to vote because you've never been taught how to read. And so this was an extremely unfair system, and these voting restrictions were in place to make it so African Americans couldn't vote. Poor and African Americans and those that couldn't read were basically being denied the right to vote. And it was a sneaky and underhanded way of doing it. More on segregation. Segregation, and know this for your test, hint, hint, wink, wink, hint, hint, wink, wink. Segregation is the legal separation of races, which means by law it was allowed to be racist, to separate, as you can see in the picture here. And this is the way it used to be in the South. This is an actual photo. There were 2 drinking fountains, one for whites, one for blacks. There were 2 schools there used to be, one for whites, one for blacks. And you can use your own imagination. Which one do you think was better? Of these 2 drinking fountains, this looks like the nicer drinking fountain. Whites had better schools. Whites had better movie theaters. Whites had, better services. They had better resources than your colored, your African Americans, and what they were given. Races were separated in schools, restaurants, theaters, trains, hospitals, even cemeteries. There were black cemeteries and white cemeteries. This racist attitude was so prevalent they didn't even want their dead lying next to one another. These segregation laws became commonly known as Jim Crow laws, as they basically put Southern blacks in a hopeless situation. These laws were basically named after this 1830 character named Jim Crow, which was an extremely racist way to look at things. Supreme Court case. You need to know this one for your test, so be sure you're paying attention on this one. Supreme Court case, Plessy versus Ferguson, 1896, orders segregation is legal as long as the facilities are, and this is in quotation marks for a reason, equal. So as long as you had separate drinking fountains here, as long as they were, again, quote-unquote, equal, it was allowed. And so people in the South said, well, these are equal. That's a drinking fountain, that's a drinking fountain. They each have one. It's all set. No problem. In reality, were they equal? I think that's up for debate. But, again, this Plessy versus Ferguson, you were actually allowed to be racist, and it was law that you could be by separating blacks from whites. It was not until 1954 that Plessy versus Ferguson was overturned by the Supreme Court decision Brown versus Board of Education. You are talking, in the span of American history, around 60 years. That's it. Think of how old your grandparents are. Many of your grandparents were alive and went to school before blacks and whites could go to school together. If any of you have ever seen this movie, Remember the Titans. This movie, yes, I always get kids, well, it's about football. Yes, it's about football. But it's bigger than that. It's about this struggle to bring together African Americans and whites into the same school in the South. And this movie, if you haven't seen it, it details very well, kind of what life was like in the racist South in the 1950s and 60s. This issue of segregation was a hot topic during the Civil Rights Movement in the 1960s, which is a huge part of what you will learn about in your 9th grade American Studies class. And take a look at this sign. These are actual signs that people saw. You couldn't get a job if you were an African American because they only would hire whites. That was the only objective here. What I kind of want to leave you with here is, in your estimation, in your estimation, is racism still a problem today in the United States? And if you say yes, here's some reasons you might say that. I ask this question every year, and if I was in class with you today, I would ask it with all of you. The percentage of students who have heard a racial slur at school. I would guess, if you're listening to this, probably all of you have heard a racial slur at school before. Many of you even may have been a person who has said a racial slur at school. I ask this every year, and every year in every class, over 50% of the kids tell me that they have heard a racial slur in school within the last day or so. If you believe racism is still a problem in the United States today, maybe that's one of the reasons why. This man right here, Don Imus. A few years ago, Mr. Imus, by the way, is a famous radio talk show host. And he referred to the Rutgers women's basketball team. And this isn't a phrase I want repeated. I'm just quoting what Mr. Imus said, but he actually referred to this predominantly black women's basketball team, and he referred to them as, quote, a bunch of nappy-headed hoes, end quote. Mr. Imus' statement is very alarming to think that someone with national fame, someone who has a nationally syndicated talk show on the radio, and he says these type of things. Is that racist? Is it still a problem? Up to you. On average, and this is still true in the United States today, black Americans make less money than white Americans. Now, some people would argue there are other reasons for that, and I'll let you I'll let you make the decision on that. But that's a fact. That black Americans, on average, make less than white Americans. If you say no, racism is not a problem in today's society, maybe you would say, well, affirmative action programs. Affirmative action programs are programs that give African Americans and people in minorities more opportunities in college and to get jobs, to make sure that that things are fair and that the opportunities are given. Some of you would say, hey, Mr. Basin, there are very successful African Americans, including Barack Obama. I mean, you're talking a president of the United States is African American. And some of you would argue, how in the world can that be racist when we've had a black president? No, we're not racist. And maybe you make that argument. There is no segregation today. As we mentioned in the last slide, Brown versus Board of Education, you are not allowed. It is illegal to separate blacks from whites. And you talk about these famous African Americans. You can say, LeBron James, one of the most famous basketball players of all time. NBA champion, who a lot of sports fans just love. He's an African American. He's very successful. You have musical and performing artists like Kanye West, where you can say, well, you know what, he's successful. So that shows maybe that there isn't racism. And some of you may even say the attitudes of most people aren't not racist at all. And so I don't know which side you fall on. But I think it's something that you have to at least think about. In your mind, is racism still a problem today in the United States? Maybe yes, maybe no. Or maybe you fall somewhere in between. Maybe it is a problem, but how big a problem is it? And these are just questions that I want you to consider as you go through and answer the questions. What I would like you to do, I'm going to kind of go through these questions with you briefly, just so you have an idea of kind of what I'm looking for. And again, I'm not going to be collecting this, but I definitely want you to be familiar with and to take a look at it. And what's going to be a little bit different is I've added one slide in there, so it could be a little bit off, but just be sure you go through these. I believe the slide I added in on Friedman's video, that would be slide 2 now. So all I have to do is I'll just slide these around for you, and this should be already corrected on your paper, so don't really worry about that. But please be sure that you at least go through these questions and you answer them to the best of your ability. And if you have any questions, feel free to let me know once I'm back in class. If you have questions, then I guess let me know. Be sure you get this done. Have a good rest of your day.